Look, I'm going to tell you about something that happened to a family I know in rural Michigan, and I need you to understand up front that I'm not the person it happened to. I'm the guy they told. I sat with them in their kitchen after the fact, and they walked me through it minute by minute. I've been carrying this story for 2 years now, and I'm still not entirely sure what I'm supposed to do with it. I've turned it over in my head so many times that I could recite it line for line. I've looked at it from every angle, trying to find the rationalization that would make it fit into the normal world. But the more I turn it over, the more I understand that some things don't fit into the categories we've created for them. Some things exist in the spaces between what we know and what we're willing to admit. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. The family's name is Hendricks. That's not their real name. They asked me not to use their actual name, and I respect that. Tom Hendricks works for a manufacturing company up near Traverse City. He's been there for 14 years. He's a supervisor now, which means he has responsibilities, people depending on him, a reputation to maintain. He's the kind of man who doesn't get rattled easily. He's worked with machinery his whole life, understands systems and mechanics, the way things work when you pay attention to detail. Linda works as a nurse at Munson Healthcare up in Traverse City. She's the kind of person who stays calm in emergencies because she's trained herself to compartmentalize. She deals with life and death situations regularly enough that she knows how to keep her mind clear when circumstances demand it. They have 2 kids, Sarah, who was 12 at the time of the encounter, and Michael, who was 9. Sarah's the kind of kid who reads constantly, spends time on the internet, knows about the world in ways that kids from earlier generations didn't. Michael's still at that age where he believes what the adults around him tell him, where authority figures haven't fully lost their credibility yet. They lived in a house set back about a quarter-mile off County Road 637, surrounded by mixed forest and scrubland. The property had belonged to Tom's family for 3 generations. His grandfather had purchased it in the 1950s as a weekend retreat. His father had expanded the house, put in the garage, established the property line with fencing that he'd maintained for decades. The kind of property where you look out your kitchen window and see trees, nothing but trees, for miles in every direction. In the distance, you can see the Mackinac Straits area, but it's far enough away that it feels removed from civilization. The kind of place where you can forget that the rest of the world exists if you're not careful. They also had a German Shepherd named Duke. German Shepherds are smart dogs. They are bred to work, to think, to react. They're built for intelligence and responsiveness. If you've ever spent time around a well-trained German Shepherd, you understand that they're not just dogs. They're thinking creatures that can read situations and respond with more nuance than most animals. Duke was 5 years old when this happened, and by all accounts, he was exactly what you'd want in a dog. Protective, but not aggressive. Alert. The kind of dog that knows the difference between a neighbor's car and a stranger's. He could read the mood of the house and respond appropriately. If someone was sad, he'd be gentler. If someone was happy, he'd be more playful. He was the kind of dog that understood the people around him at a level that sometimes made you wonder whether dogs really are smarter than we are give them credit for. This was late October, right at that point in the year when it gets dark early and the temperature drops fast. October 18th, 2022, a Tuesday. The weather that day had been unseasonably warm, which Tom said later felt wrong somehow. The kind of warmth that doesn't fit the season, that makes you feel like something's off, even if you can't put your finger on exactly what. Tom was in the garage working on a truck engine, wearing heavy canvas coveralls and a fleece. The garage had that smell that garages have when you've been working on an engine for a while. Oil and metal and the faint ghost of gasoline, mixed with the sawdust he scattered on the concrete floor to absorb spills. He had his hands deep in the engine block, trying to figure out why the fuel injector was acting up. His fingers were dark with grease, and he'd already wiped his forehead with his wrist about a dozen times, leaving a streak of engine oil across his brow. Linda was inside putting together dinner. She'd started early because she had the evening shift coming up later that week, and she wanted to make sure they had meals prepped and ready. She was making a lasagna from scratch, the kind that takes hours, the kind where you brown the meat and build the sauce layer by layer. The house smelled like garlic and oregano and tomato reduction, that smell that fills a kitchen when someone's actually cooking rather than just heating something up. The kids were in the living room, homework spread across the coffee table, in that way kids do when they're pretending to work while actually thinking about anything else. Sarah had a history assignment that she was only halfway paying attention to. Michael was working through some math problems, but mostly he was thinking about a video game he'd been wanting to play. Duke was outside. He had a dog door that let him in and out of the garage. Tom kept the door open so Duke could come back in when he wanted. That's important because Duke could have come inside at any time. He didn't. He stayed out. which suggests that whatever decision Duke made in that moment was a deliberate choice. He wasn't going to retreat. He wasn't going to hide. He was going to stand his ground. What Tom noticed first was the sound. He heard Duke barking. Not the usual bark, not the alert bark when a car passes on the road. Not the playful bark he'd make if he wanted to go for a walk or if he'd spotted a squirrel. This was different, steady, continuous. A warning bark, a holding bark. The kind of bark a dog makes when it's between something and something else, and it's making a choice about which way the danger is coming. Tom said it was the kind of sound that made the hair on his neck stand up, even though he didn't know why. He didn't consciously register the threat yet, but his body did. His body knew something was wrong. Tom came out of the garage and called for Duke. Duke didn't respond. He kept barking. Tom wiped his hands on a rag, trying to get the worst of the grease off, and walked toward the sound. Duke was over by the edge of the property, where the forest starts and the mowed grass ends. The grass there was maybe 3 feet tall, hadn't been cut in a while because that section wasn't as visible from the house. His body was rigid, all his weight forward, his eyes locked on the tree line. Tom could see the muscles in Duke's shoulders, the way his whole frame was tensed, coiled, ready for something Tom couldn't yet comprehend. Then Tom saw the figure. He described it later as a moment where his brain kind of stuttered. There was something at the edge of the woods about 40 yards away, and his mind was trying to figure out what he was looking at. His first thought, he said, was that it was a bear standing on its hind legs. That was the default explanation his brain offered, but even as he thought it, something in the image wasn't matching the mental category he was trying to fit it into. Taller than any person, broader, standing on its hind legs, but not the way a bear stands. It wasn't balanced on its back legs the way a standing bear is, swaying, arms up for balance. This was different. This thing was upright. Its posture was something between human and animal, but the proportions were all wrong. The arms hung long, almost to its knees. The shoulders were too wide, too muscular. The head was massive and tapered, not rounded like a human head, but pointed, extended, like something designed for a different purpose. The color was dark, almost black, even though it was late afternoon and the light was still decent. Duke saw it too. Duke definitely saw it. Tom said the dog's entire focus was on this thing. There was no distraction, no divided attention. Duke was completely locked in on what was at the tree line. Tom said the thing in the tree line didn't move. It just stood there, absolutely still. Not the way a living thing usually stands still, with micro movements and shifts in weight. This was a different kind of stillness, the kind of stillness of something that's completely focused on something else. And Duke didn't rush it. He didn't do what a dog is supposed to do when it sees a threat, lunging forward, trying to drive the intruder away. He didn't advance. He planted himself on the grass between the garage and the tree line, and he barked, steady, rhythmic, like he was building a wall with his voice. Like he was saying, "Here is the line. You do not cross this line. I will not allow it." Tom is a practical man. He works with his hands. He's not someone who spooks easily, but he said the moment was the strangest moment of his life. He called for Duke again, this time not a casual call, a command. Duke didn't break his stare. He kept barking. Tom went back into the garage and got the rifle he kept there, a .30-06 Winchester. He came back out, rifle down, safety off, and he looked at the tree line again. The thing was still there, exactly where it had been, not moving. He raised the rifle and pointed it at the figure. He said he was going to fire a warning shot. Let whatever this was know that there was a man with a gun defending this property. But before he could do that, the thing moved. It turned. Its shoulders rotated, and its torso twisted back into the woods. Not all at once. Slow. Deliberate. Like it was turning to look at something off to the side. Then it stepped backward, one long step, and it was gone into the shadows of the trees. Duke stopped barking. Tom stood there with the rifle for a minute, looking at the spot where the thing had been. He wasn't sure what had just happened. He called Duke, and this time Duke came, trotting over to him, still alert, ears up. But the intensity was gone. Whatever had been at the tree line was no longer a threat. Tom went inside. He locked the garage door. He locked the back door. He went into the living room and told Linda and the kids that they needed to get upstairs and stay there. He didn't go into details. He just said it. Linda knew him well enough not to argue. Tom came back to me with this story about a week after it happened. We were at a restaurant, nothing fancy, just a place near his work. He waited until we were sitting down and the waiter was gone. And then he told me everything. He said he'd been thinking about it every day. He couldn't rationalize it. He couldn't make it fit into anything he knew. I asked him what he thought it was. He said the only thing that came to mind was the stories he'd heard growing up. Stories his grandfather had told. Stories about things that lived in the deeper woods. things that weren't supposed to be hunted, things that hunted you back. His grandfather had been old-school Michigander, back from an era when the woods meant something different. He'd said there were things in those forests that most people never saw because they had the good sense to stay away. But occasionally, something came close to the edge. Something got curious or hungry or territorial. And that's when people got a glimpse of something they weren't meant to see.
Quick thing before we move on. I have this book coming out. It's called the Dogman Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. Been working on it for a long time. So if you want to check that out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
After Tom told me what happened, I started researching. I looked into the history of the area. Rural Michigan has a long history of stories. Stories about something that locals call the Dogman. Not in the modern cryptid sense where something is a curiosity or a tourist attraction. In the historical sense. The way people talked about other dangerous animals. Respectfully. With an understanding that it was there, it was real, and the best you could do was stay out of its way. The stories go back. Way back. The Anishinaabe people who lived in that region had stories about something in the forests. The stories changed depending on which band you were talking to and which time period you were in, but the core was consistent. There was something. It was large. It was intelligent. It was dangerous if threatened. The first European settlers encountered these stories. They heard them from indigenous people, and they filed them away as superstition. But then settlers started disappearing, not in droves, not in a way that would have sparked a formal investigation, but enough that people in the frontier settlements knew to be cautious. Cattle went missing, hunters vanished. A farm family would report something large moving through their pasture at night. A man would be found dead under circumstances that made no sense. By the mid-1800s, there were formal accounts. Newspaper records from the time describe incidents. A hunter who claims he saw something massive walking on its hind legs. A logger who swears he heard something howling that didn't sound like any wolf. A family that reports being stalked by something large enough to leave prints in the mud that looked like no animal anyone had ever documented. Then, in 1887, there's an account from a man named Jean-Baptiste. He was a French-Canadian trapper working in northern Michigan. He kept a journal. In the journal, he describes an encounter with something that he calls a beast man. His words were specific. He said it stood about 7 feet tall. It had a face that was part dog and part human. It was covered in dark fur. It had eyes that were intelligent, eyes that tracked him with intention. He said he didn't shoot it. He was certain that if he'd pulled the trigger, the thing would have come for him. Instead, he backed away slowly, keeping his hands visible. He said the beast man watched him for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then it turned and walked back into the forest. Jean-Baptiste lived another 30 years. He kept trapping. He never encountered the thing again, but he said he would never forget the way it looked at him. He said it was the most unsettling moment of his life. There are dozens of accounts like this in the historical record. The stories accelerate in frequency during the Great Depression, when more people were hunting and trapping in the deep woods out of necessity. The 1930s through the 1950s have account after account. A man would vanish. A search party would find tracks that made no sense. Livestock would be killed in ways that seemed deliberately cruel. No predator native to Michigan killed animals the way these kills were described. Then the stories changed, or they didn't change exactly. They became quieter. People stopped reporting them to newspapers. The accounts moved to private journals, stories told by grandfathers to their grandchildren, whispered conversations between hunters who knew what they'd seen but also knew no one would believe them. The thing about stories that old, stories that many, is that they eventually move into the folklore category. They get written about by cryptid enthusiasts. They get featured on podcasts and YouTube channels. They become campfire stories. And somewhere in that process, they stop being history and become entertainment. But Tom's story wasn't entertainment. It was immediate. It had happened a week before he told me. It was still fresh enough that he was still processing it. I decided to talk to other people. I went back to the area. I spent some time in Traverse City, and I made contact with people who had lived in that region their entire lives. I didn't lead with Tom's story. I just asked if people had heard about unusual wildlife, things that didn't match any known species, things that people kept quiet about. The stories came pouring out. A woman named Margaret had grown up on a farm near Kalkaska. She was in her 70s when I talked to her, living in the same house she'd been born in, on the same land her family had worked for 5 generations. She remembered her father telling her to never go into the back 40 acres alone. She was maybe 8 or 9 at the time, and she'd asked why. He said there were things back there that were best left alone. She asked what kind of things. He didn't answer. He just looked at her with a seriousness that made her understand that this wasn't a question she should keep asking. She said she saw something once when she was 17. She was out in the pasture checking on the cattle, and she heard a sound like nothing she'd ever heard before. It came from the forest edge, about 300 yards away. She described it as a cross between a howl and a scream, but with something underneath it that made her think of intelligence. There was an intentionality to the sound. It wasn't an animal sound. Animals don't make sounds that carry that kind of complexity. The hair on her arms stood up. She said every instinct in her body told her to run, so she did. She said she ran back to the house, her heart pounding, and she didn't stop running until she was inside with the door locked. Her father just nodded when she told him. He didn't seem surprised. He asked her if she'd seen anything, and when she said no, he seemed relieved. But he didn't explain. He just told her to stay away from that part of the property. An old man named Edward told me about his grandfather, who'd been a logger in the 1920s, working in what's now the Mackinac Wilderness area. One of his crew had been killed in a way that nobody could explain. The body was found about half a mile from the logging camp, in a clearing near a stream. The body was found, but it was arranged in a way that suggested intention. Edward's grandfather said the body was positioned on its back, with the arms folded across the chest. The tracks around the body suggested the killer was large, bipedal, and had taken its time with the body. There were claw marks, but they were deliberate, almost surgical, not the frantic tearing that would come from a predator in a feeding frenzy. The official report said it was a bear attack, but Edward's grandfather said bears didn't arrange bodies. Bears didn't position things with care and intention. Bears didn't seem to make decisions about what they did after a kill. They ate and they moved on. This was different. This was something that had taken time to arrange the body the way it had arranged it. And Edward's grandfather, who was not a superstitious man, believed that the arrangement was a message. He just didn't know what the message was. A woman named Judith told me about her husband. He was a hunter, had been hunting since he was young, spent a lot of his free time in the woods pursuing game. He was good at it. He respected the animals he hunted. He never hunted for sport, only for sustenance. One day, in the fall of 1987, he came back early from a hunting trip. He was supposed to be gone for 3 days. He came back after one. He was shaken in a way that Judith said she'd never seen before. He wouldn't talk about what he'd seen. He wouldn't answer her questions. He just sat in the living room, staring at nothing, his rifle propped against the wall in the corner. He said he was done hunting. Judith asked why. He said he'd seen something, and after that, he didn't feel right hunting anymore. He never went back into the woods after that. He sold his rifle to a friend, a nice .308 that he'd owned for 15 years. He spent the rest of his life keeping a closer eye on his property than most people would consider normal. He installed outdoor lights. He kept certain areas of the woods cleared. He spent a lot of time on his porch in the evenings, watching the treeline. He passed away in 1999, and Judith still doesn't know exactly what he saw. He never told her. He took it to his grave. The patterns in these stories were consistent. Whatever these things are, they seem to 1. Avoid direct confrontation with armed humans. 2. Communicate with animals. Dogs especially seem to recognize them. 3. Operate primarily at night or in low light. 4. Show signs of intelligence that exceed what you'd expect from a predator. 5. Appear to be territorial in ways that suggest they think about property and boundaries. Tom's story fit the pattern perfectly. His dog recognized the presence. The thing didn't attack even though it had every opportunity. It backed away from the rifle. It seemed to be observing as much as it was being observed. What I found most interesting was what came after. I asked Tom what happened in the days following the encounter. He said Duke's behavior changed. The dog became hypervigilant. He'd bark at the treeline on certain nights. He'd refuse to go to the back of the property alone. He'd stay inside more than he used to. But after about 3 weeks, he calmed down. By November, he was back to his normal self. Whatever territorial understanding had been established seemed to hold. I asked Tom if he'd seen the thing again. He said no. But he said a few times, on clear nights, he's heard something moving through the forest at a distance, something large, something that sounds intentional in how it moves. But it stays away from the property. It respects the boundary. That word, respects, stuck with me. Tom used it without thinking, as if he was describing something that understood rules, that negotiated borders, that made decisions based on mutual understanding. A lot of the modern Dogman stories come from the 1980s, the Allegan County sightings, the documented accounts from people who claim to have seen something bipedal and massive. But what struck me most about the older accounts was how matter-of-fact they were. People didn't speculate about what the thing was. They had categories for it. It was a danger. It had to be managed. If you disturbed it, it would respond. If you left it alone, it would leave you alone. The The question that kept coming back to me was this: if these things are real, and if they're intelligent enough to understand human territory and human threats, then what are they? What species of animal develops that level of cognition? What evolutionary path produces something that size, that strength, that intelligence? The obvious answer was to consider it a surviving population of something, a species that made it through the extinction events that wiped out most large predators, or a species that avoided being discovered because it stayed hidden. A species that understood how to live alongside humans without being documented or cataloged. But that raised other questions. If it survived, how many are left? How do they breed? How do they sustain a population without being seen more frequently? And if they're intelligent, what is their social structure? Do they have communities? Do they have language? Tom had no answers to any of these questions. He just knew what he'd seen, and he knew that his dog's behavior had been the only thing standing between his family and direct contact. I went back to the house. Tom showed me the property. He showed me the spot where Duke had stood. He showed me the tree line. In daylight, it looked ordinary. Dense forest. Nothing unusual. But standing there, imagining that shape moving at the edge of the darkness, I understood why Duke had barked. There was an intelligence to the forest, a watchfulness. Or maybe I was just primed to feel it. Maybe my brain was doing what brains do, which is finding patterns and meaning in shadows. But then Tom showed me something else. He took me to the back edge of the property, about 100 yards into the tree line. There was an old logging road that had been abandoned for decades. Weeds had reclaimed most of it, but you could still see the path. And on the trees flanking the road, there were marks. Not fresh marks, but clear enough. Long scratches, deep gouges in the bark. The kind of marks that an animal would make if it was gripping the tree, pulling at the bark. Tom said he'd never noticed these before. Or he had, but he'd written them off as deer rubs or bear damage. But looking at them now, in the context of what he'd seen, they took on a different significance. These weren't random. They were deliberate. They were territorial markers. I asked Tom if he'd reported anything to the State Wildlife Authority. He said he hadn't. He said he knew what would happen. They'd tell him it was a bear. They'd tell him he'd seen something in the dark and his mind had filled in details. They'd suggest he install motion-activated lights. They'd give him some standard wildlife management talk. But Tom knows his land. He knows what bears do. He knows what foxes do. He knows what wolves do. And he knows that this didn't fit any of those categories. So he's doing what people in that region have done for generations. He's living with the knowledge that something is out there, and he's respecting the boundary. He's let the thing know that his property is defended. And the thing has acknowledged that. It respects the territory. The Book of Enoch mentions something interesting. In the ancient text, there's a reference to watchers. And among the watchers, there are beings that are described as having animal characteristics. The text describes creatures that are part human and part beast. The description is vague, but some scholars have suggested that it's referencing a species or a type of being that the ancient people encountered. It's easy to dismiss this as mythology, but mythology often preserves real encounters. It preserves them through the lens of the people who experienced them, which means the details might be metaphorical or distorted by the passage of time. But the core often remains true. Something was there. It was significant enough to remember. It was significant enough to record. I spent time talking to members of the Anishinaabe Nation who still live in the region. I was cautious about how I approached these conversations. I didn't want to come in as an outsider, asking about cryptids. I wanted to understand the cultural framework that had shaped how people in that region understood the forest and the beings that inhabited it. What I found was that the Anishinaabe traditions include references to these beings, but not in the way that modern cryptid enthusiasts retell them. Not as monsters or cryptids or creatures to be hunted or feared. Instead, they're understood as inhabitants of the forest that require respect, the way any being inhabiting territory requires respect. One man I spoke with, a tribal elder named William, told me that his grandfather had taught him that the forests were inhabited by many beings. Some were animals that could be hunted for food. Some were beings that existed in a different relationship with the forest, with knowledge and intelligence that matched or exceeded human intelligence. Those beings, his grandfather had told him, were to be respected. If you encountered one, you acknowledged its right to be there. You respected its territory. You understood that it was not your place to hunt or capture or study these beings. Your place was to acknowledge them and move on. I asked him if his grandfather had ever told him about encounters with these beings. William said his grandfather had indicated that such encounters happened, but that they were sacred moments, not to be discussed casually or shared with outsiders. The encounters were between the human and the being, and the relationship created by that encounter was personal and private. He said his grandfather had warned him that talking too much about these beings, trying to prove their existence, trying to document them, was a violation of the understanding between humans and these beings. It would break the agreement. It would change the nature of the relationship. The Anishinaabe traditions include similar references to this concept, not in the way that modern cryptid enthusiasts retell them, but in the original oral traditions that were preserved by families. There were things in the forest that required respect. Respect wasn't just about fear, though fear was part of it. It was about understanding that these beings had their own territory, their own rights, their own ways of being in the world. And if you violated those boundaries, if you treated them as objects of study rather than as intelligences with their own agency, you risked direct conflict. The conflict wasn't punishment, it was consequence. It was the natural result of violating an understanding that had been established long before humans arrived in the region. Tom told me that after the encounter, he'd asked his kids if they'd been scared. Sarah said she was, but only for a minute. After that, she felt okay. She said it was like her dad was handling it. She said Duke was handling it. It was like watching adults take care of something that needed taking care of. Michael said he didn't even know what was happening until it was over. Linda said nothing happened. She went upstairs when Tom told her to. She heard him come up later. He said he'd locked up the house. She asked if everything was okay. He said it would be. What strikes me about that moment is the normalcy of it. These are people who experienced something extraordinary, and they processed it by falling back on the ordinary rhythms of their lives. They locked the doors. They went to bed. They woke up the next morning, and they went about their days. The thing that doesn't go back to normal is the knowledge. Tom knows something that most people don't. He knows that there are other intelligences in the world. He knows that they operate according to their own rules. He knows that those rules include respecting human territory and understanding human threats. And his dog knew it the moment the thing stepped out of the tree line. The reason I want to tell you this second part is because it gives context. It shows that Tom's experience isn't unique. And it starts to suggest that if these things are real, and if they're present in significant numbers, then we have a fundamental question about what our world actually contains. After my initial conversations in Traverse City, I started looking deeper into the records. I went to the regional library. I looked through old newspaper archives. I searched historical societies. And what I found was a pattern of incidents that suggested these encounters happened more frequently than modern cryptid enthusiasts realized. The difference was that the old accounts didn't sensationalize what happened. They reported it. A logger sees something unusual, he reports it to his supervisor. The supervisor files it away. The logging company might modify their operations, keep crews out of certain areas, adjust their work schedule. But there was no need to investigate further. There was no need to prove the existence of something that was known to exist. It was only when newspapers started reporting these stories that they became entertainment. And when they became entertainment, they were filtered through a lens of skepticism and curiosity that didn't exist in the original accounts. I found a reference in a 1902 newspaper from Grayling, Michigan. It was a brief account, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it specifically. A man named William Castor had been found dead in the woods about 5 miles from town. The official cause of death was listed as injuries consistent with an animal attack, but the article noted, in language that was carefully neutral but somehow conveyed deep unease, that the injuries were not consistent with any known predator in the area. The coroner's report mentioned claw marks and bite marks, but the span between the bite marks suggested a jaw that was too large and too powerful to belong to any animal they could identify. William Castor was a hunter, a competent one, by all accounts. He'd been hunting in those woods for 20 years. He knew the territory. He knew what dangers existed out there. He'd been missing for 2 days when they found him. When they recovered his body, it had already begun to decompose, which made determining exact cause of time of death difficult. But based on the decomposition and the coroner's best estimate, Castor had died roughly 12 hours after he went missing. So he'd survived whatever initial attack had occurred, and then he'd died sometime in the following hours. His gun was found about 30 yards from the body. It was fully loaded. No shots had been fired. Tom's not carrying his gun for defense against something he's afraid of. He's carrying it as a symbol. He's saying, I am armed, I am dangerous, and I will defend myself if needed. But he never got the chance to use it. Whatever happened to William Castor happened too fast, or he made the decision not to fire. Maybe he saw what was attacking him and realized that a gun would only make things worse. The article concluded by noting that William Castor's family was requesting privacy, and that the coroner was recommending that hunters avoid the area in which the body had been found until the situation could be better understood. There was no call for a hunting party, no organized effort to track down and kill the predator, just a quiet recommendation to stay away. I searched for follow-up articles. I spent hours in the newspaper archive. microfilm reader straining my eyes in the dim light of the Historical Society basement, looking for any mention of William Castor, or the death, or any investigation. I wanted to know if there was any follow-up, any attempt to understand what had killed William Castor. There was nothing. No follow-up articles, no investigation announced in subsequent editions. Nothing but silence. And in that silence, I could hear something. I could hear the decision that had been made. The decision not to look too closely, the decision to accept that some deaths had to be accepted without explanation. I found his grave in a cemetery outside Grayling. He died at age 31, married according to his headstone. One child. The grave was well maintained, but there were no recent flowers or markers, just the stone, decades old, noting his existence and his death. I tried to find records of his family. I wanted to know if anyone had preserved the story, but the family had either died out or moved away. There was nothing to find. The gap in the record was interesting. These things happened. People died. But there was no desire to investigate further. There was no attempt to hunt down or kill the thing that had done this. There was just an acceptance that something dangerous existed, and that the best policy was to avoid the situations that put you in contact with it. This pattern repeated itself in account after account. A man would die under mysterious circumstances. The cause would be listed as animal attack. There would be a brief mention in the newspaper, and then nothing. The incident would be filed away. The family would grieve. The community would adjust its behavior to account for the danger, and life would continue. By the 1930s, this was happening so frequently that it seems to have become almost normalized. There are entries in hunting logs from the period that refer to the usual thing happening. A hunter would note that he decided not to hunt in a particular area because the usual thing is active. Other hunters would understand what he meant. There's a phrase that shows up repeatedly in the accounts from that era. It happens. 2 words. But they carry the weight of acceptance. It happens. It's part of the world. It's part of the cost of living in these forests and making your living from them. I found a more detailed account in a private journal that was donated to a historical society in Kalkaska. The journal belonged to a man named Robert Whitmore, who was a hunter and a trapper in the 1940s. He kept detailed records of his hunts and his catches. He also kept records of unusual occurrences. In an entry from October of 1947, he wrote the following. Encountered it again today, same place as before, where the creek makes the sharp bend near the northern ridge. I was coming through the cedar grove when I saw movement ahead. My immediate thought was elk, but the gait was wrong. The stance was wrong. I stepped behind a stand of trees and watched. It had to be 8 feet tall, maybe 9. The shape was unmistakably bipedal. The hair was dark, almost black. The arms were long and powerful. I watched for perhaps 30 seconds. It didn't see me. It was focused on something downstream, moving along the bank slowly, testing the air. Then it sensed something and raised its head, not toward me, toward the creek. It descended the bank with a strange backward walking motion and waded into the water. I could not see it anymore after that. The water is deep in that section. I waited for an hour for it to emerge. It did not. I left the area and did not return to hunt there again. Some things are meant to be left alone. Robert Whitmore continued hunting for another 20 years. He filled his journals with detailed notes about his catches, his techniques, the animals he saw. But there are no more entries about encountering the thing. He apparently kept his word. He left it alone. What strikes me about this account is the level of respect. This was a man who hunted. He was competent in the wilderness. He understood danger. And when he encountered this thing, he didn't see it as something to conquer or prove. He saw it as something to acknowledge and respect. He adjusted his behavior accordingly. That pattern of respect appears in nearly every account I found. People who encountered these things didn't try to hunt them. They didn't try to capture them or study them. They just left them alone. They told others to leave them alone. And they seemed to accept that these beings had a right to exist in the world, just as much as humans did. This runs counter to how we typically respond to large predators. When people encounter bears or wolves or large cats, our modern response is to hunt them, study them, try to understand them through the lens of scientific inquiry. We collect data, we publish papers, we track populations and manage habitats. None of that has happened with whatever these things are. There's been no systematic attempt to understand them. There's been no effort to document them in a way that would establish their reality beyond doubt. It's as if the people who encounter them have a collective agreement not to push the issue. I asked Tom about this. I asked him if he'd ever considered trying to get proof. A trail camera, a hair sample, something that would document the thing's existence in an undeniable way. He said he'd thought about it, but he said he didn't feel right about it. He said that if the thing wanted to make itself known to science, it would have done so already. He said that capturing proof would be a kind of violation. It would change the nature of the arrangement. That word again, arrangement, as if there's an understanding between humans and these things about how they're going to coexist. I spent a lot of time in that region, talking to people, looking at records, trying to build a comprehensive picture of what was happening. And what emerged was a portrait of a species or a type of being that had learned to live in close proximity to humans without being seen or documented by humans. They hunted in certain areas. They avoided others. They seemed to understand that humans had certain weapons that could be dangerous if provoked. And they seemed to operate according to their own ethical framework that included a concept of territory and the rights of beings to occupy space. It's not what you'd expect if you were approaching the question from the perspective of cryptozoology. Cryptozoologists typically assume that an unknown large animal would be aggressively trying to expand its range, establish dominance, and interact with humans in visible ways. The evidence from the historical record suggests something different. It suggests a species or a type of being that is deliberately keeping itself hidden, that is deliberately maintaining a separation between itself and human civilization. The question that emerged for me was not whether these things exist. The historical record strongly suggests they do. The question was why they exist. What evolutionary or developmental path led to their emergence? And what are the implications for how we understand the world and our place in it? Tom's encounter with the thing on his property became, in my mind, less about a close call with danger and more about a moment of negotiation. His dog established the boundary. The thing acknowledged the boundary, and an understanding was reached. The thing would not approach the property. In exchange, the family would not pursue it, would not try to capture it or expose it or prove its existence. It's not a bad arrangement. It's the kind of arrangement that's been working for generations. What I couldn't stop thinking about was what would happen if that arrangement broke down. If someone reported one of these sightings to the state wildlife authority and convinced them to investigate. If scientists became involved, if university researchers started studying the phenomenon, if trail cameras captured definitive footage, if the truth of these things' existence became established beyond doubt, what would come next? I tried to imagine the sequence of events. First, there would be denial. The scientific establishment would dismiss the evidence as misidentification or hoax or camera malfunction. There would be skeptics who would demand more evidence, more proof, more documentation. The believers would push harder, gather more data, present their findings at conferences. Eventually, the weight of evidence would become too large to ignore. Then there would be official investigation. Universities would request funding for research. The Department of Natural Resources would open an investigation. There would be meetings with state authorities. They would want to understand what they were dealing with. How many were there? What was their range? What was their threat level to human populations? Were they protected by the Endangered Species Act? Could they be hunted? And then came the phase that Tom said he was most afraid of. The phase where humans decided they needed to manage the population. Tranquilizer darts and tracking collars, DNA samples and blood work, live capture and relocation, or if the beings were deemed too dangerous, culling operations. The entire apparatus of wildlife management would be brought to bear on something that had successfully avoided that apparatus for generations. I tried to imagine what that would look like. Military contractors hired to track these beings through the forest. Thermal imaging technology to locate them at night. Dogs trained to find their scent. Fencing erected to contain them. And these beings, these intelligent beings that understood negotiation and respect, would be forced into conflict. They would be hunted. Their territory would be invaded. Their families would be separated. And given that these things seem to have a level of intelligence that approaches or possibly exceeds that of some human populations, the outcome seemed predictable. There would be conflict. There would be deaths on both sides. Some humans would be killed in the struggle. Some of these beings would be captured or killed. There would be an attempt to eliminate the threat, which is to say, an attempt to eliminate the species, or at least to reduce its population to a level where it was no longer considered a danger. The best-case scenario might be that some of these beings would be captured and kept in captivity for study, in zoos or research facilities, kept behind glass and studied like any other large primate. That would be a kind of living death, I think. To possess that level of intelligence and be confined to a cage for the purposes of human research, to have your existence turned into a spectacle, your behavior analyzed and categorized and discussed in scientific papers, and the arrangement would be broken. The understanding that had held for generations would be shattered. The boundary would be violated. And the beings that had chosen to coexist with humans, that had established territories and respected property lines and made decisions based on mutual understanding, would learn that humans were not capable of that kind of respect. They would learn that human promises meant nothing, that human boundaries were negotiable, that coexistence was not possible. Tom said that's what he was afraid of, not of the thing in the forest. He was afraid of what would happen if humans found out it was there. Tom understood this. It's why he hadn't reported what he'd seen. It's why he'd asked me to change his name. It's why he'd urged me not to sensationalize his story or use it as proof of the Dogman's existence. He said he wanted these things to survive. He said he was okay living with the knowledge that they were there, that they were watching from the tree line, that they had claims to the land that predated his own. He was okay with that arrangement. He wanted others to be okay with it too, but he knew that wouldn't happen. He knew that if this story became public, if it generated enough interest and investigation, the outcome was foreordained. The thing would be exposed. It would be hunted. It would be killed or captured. It would be studied. It would be understood and cataloged and ultimately destroyed or imprisoned. So we're left with this choice. We can pretend we don't know. We can maintain the fiction that everything large enough to be dangerous has been documented and categorized by science. We can live as if the wilderness is fully known and mapped and controlled. Or we can accept what people in that region have always accepted, that there are things in the deep forests, that these things have rights and territories and ways of being that we don't fully understand, that our job is not to understand them or control them or prove their existence. Our job is to respect the boundary, to live alongside them without encroachment, to accept that the world is stranger than we've admitted, and that's okay. Tom's German shepherd made that choice clear. The dog saw the thing, the dog understood it, and the dog conveyed to his human that this was something to respect, not something to fear or attack. The thing acknowledged the dog, it acknowledged the territory, and it withdrew. That's the arrangement, that's how it works. I think about that moment sometimes. I think about Tom standing in his garage with the rifle, watching the thing at the edge of the tree line. I think about the decision the thing made to turn and withdraw. I think about Duke's bark, which wasn't an attack bark but a declaration of territory, an establishment of terms. And I think about how that moment represented something that we don't have very often anymore, a moment of coexistence. A moment where two intelligent beings recognized each other's right to exist and negotiated the terms of their proximity without violence or betrayal. If more moments were like that, the world would be different. Tom's family is still in Michigan. They still live in the house on the property. Duke is older now, graying around the muzzle, but still alert, still protective. Tom still works in his garage. Linda still works at the hospital. Sarah is in college. Michael is in high school. They go about their lives, and sometimes, on certain nights, they might hear something moving through the forest at a distance, something large, something that respects the boundary that Duke established. They hear it and they know it's there, and they're okay with that. They've made their peace with the fact that the world is inhabited by things that we're not supposed to understand, not supposed to capture, not supposed to prove. They're okay living in a world where mystery is allowed to remain a mystery, where some things stay hidden, not because they're afraid to be seen, but because they're choosing not to be seen, because they understand that being seen brings danger, and they're content to exist on the edges, in the deep forests, where humans don't often venture and where the old arrangements still hold. That's the arrangement, that's the way it works. And if you ever find yourself in similar circumstances, if you ever see something at the edge of the tree line that your brain can't quite process, remember Tom's story, remember his dog, remember what choice was made in that moment, and make the same choice. What happened after that encounter is what I want to spend time on now, because it reveals something about how these things operate, something about their intelligence, their patience, and their willingness to engage with the boundaries that humans establish. In the weeks following the October encounter, Tom became acutely aware of the presence on his property. It wasn't paranoia exactly, more like a heightened sense of attention. He started noticing things he'd previously overlooked. A deer carcass about half a mile into the woods, cleaned down to bone in a way that suggested an intelligent killer. Scat left on the perimeter of his property. Marks on trees that suggested something had been climbing or gripping or marking territory. He didn't talk to Linda about any of this. He didn't want to frighten her. He didn't discuss it with the kids. But he changed his routines in subtle ways. He installed motion-activated lights on the eastern edge of the property, where the forest was closest. He checked his tools more frequently. He left the garage door open less often. He spent more time sitting on the back porch in the evenings, rifle propped against the rail, watching the tree line. Duke's behavior during this period was the most interesting to me, when Tom described it. The dog didn't remain hypervigilant the way some dogs might. Instead, Duke seemed to settle into a kind of acceptance. He'd still bark if something came too close, but the panic was gone. It was almost as if he'd reached an understanding with whatever was out there, as if he recognized that the thing in the forest had made a choice, and that choice was to respect the boundary. Tom said there was one night, about 3 weeks after the encounter, when he heard something large moving through the brush about 200 yards from the house. He was sitting on the back porch, the rifle propped against the railing, watching the tree line the way he'd been doing every evening since that first night. The sound was unmistakable, something weighty, something bipedal, something that was moving deliberately rather than foraging, the sound of something intelligent navigating through brush and forest debris. Tom got up from his chair slowly, trying not to make sudden movements. He picked up his rifle, keeping it down and to the side, not aggressive but ready. He went to the edge of the property where the lights were installed. There were 3 motion-activated lights that he'd put up, spaced along the eastern edge where the property met the forest. They were designed to come on if movement was detected, to illuminate the boundary, and he saw it. Not the whole thing, just a shape moving through the illuminated brush. Large, dark. The proportions all wrong for anything that belonged in Michigan. It was moving on 2 legs, moving with purpose, moving with something that looked like strategy. It moved parallel to the property line, not crossing it, just moving along the boundary. Tom said it was as if the thing was patrolling its own side of the line, demonstrating that it understood the boundary existed, showing that it intended to respect it. He said the way it moved suggested that it was aware of the lights, aware that it was visible, and aware that it was choosing to stay on its side of the line anyway. The message was clear. I see you. I see your boundary. I respect it. Tom didn't raise his rifle. He didn't feel threatened in that moment. He said it was the strangest thing, because logically, he should have been terrified. This was something massive, something that could kill him if it wanted to, something that had already killed at least one person in the region. But what he felt instead was a kind of understanding, a recognition that an agreement had been reached. The thing had come to show him something, to demonstrate that it was keeping its side of the arrangement. When the shape had passed and moved back into the darkness, Tom stood there for another 10 minutes, just listening, trying to see if he could track where it went. But it moved silently after it left the illuminated area, and within minutes he had no way of knowing where it was. He went back inside and sat in the kitchen with Linda and had coffee. He didn't tell her what he'd seen. He just sat there, drinking coffee, processing the fact that he'd come face to face with something that shouldn't exist. Twice now. And both times, the thing had made a choice about how to interact with him. Both times, the interaction had been about establishing and maintaining a boundary. This is the part of the story that gets to me most, honestly, because it's the part where you have to accept that something is genuinely happening. Tom had every reason to doubt his first encounter. The light was failing. It was October, getting dark early. His mind could have been playing tricks. His perception could have been off. But this second encounter happened in November, with motion-activated lights providing illumination. It happened when Tom was alert and sober and actively looking, and what he saw confirmed what his dog had recognized from the first moment. There was something intelligent at the boundary of his property, something large, something that had made a choice about how to interact with him. I asked Tom if he'd ever considered the possibility that the thing was testing him, seeing how he'd respond, establishing its own claim to the territory and demanding that he acknowledge that claim. He said he'd thought about it, and he said the more he thought about it, the more he believed it to be true. He said that whatever this thing was, it had a concept of territory and respect that was not so different from human concepts. It wasn't randomly showing up. It was establishing a border. It was saying, this is your land, but beyond this point is mine, and I want you to know that I'm here, and I'm watching, and I'm willing to coexist with you as long as you respect that boundary. That kind of behavior suggests something more than instinct. That suggests calculation, that suggests an understanding of negotiation and conflict avoidance. I started looking deeper into the behavior patterns that emerge from the historical accounts, and what I found was a consistent pattern of what I can only describe as negotiation. Humans and these things establishing boundaries, respecting those boundaries, and then coexisting within the framework of those boundaries. A man wouldn't hunt in a particular area. The thing wouldn't approach his house. An understanding would be reached and maintained. Occasionally, the boundary would be violated. A hunter would venture into an area he wasn't supposed to hunt. He'd encounter the thing. Sometimes he'd get away. Sometimes he wouldn't. But in every account where he got away, the message was clear. Don't come back. This is not your territory. This is behavior that emerges from a system of ethics. It's not random predation. It's not territorial aggression in the way that wild animals typically express it. It's something more sophisticated. It's saying, here are the rules. You follow them, we coexist. You break them, there are consequences. which brought me back to the question that kept nagging at me. If these things exist, and if they're this intelligent, what are they? Where did they come from? How is it possible that we have no scientific documentation of them? How is it possible that they've remained hidden for this long? The answer, I think, is that they've remained hidden because they've chosen to remain hidden, because they understand that being discovered by human civilization would be catastrophic for them. They understand the pattern. A new species is discovered. Scientists study it. The military gets involved. Control is established. The population is managed, reduced, and ultimately eliminated or imprisoned. These things seem to understand that pattern intuitively. They seem to have learned from observing humans that the safest path is the hidden path, the way that doesn't involve exposure or contact or proof. This raises questions about how they achieve that level of understanding, but those are questions I don't have answers to. What I do know is that Tom's experience is consistent with a broader pattern of behavior that suggests something genuinely intelligent is occupying the deep forests of North America, and it's occupying them deliberately, with intention, with an understanding of the risks that exposure brings. Tom's family is still living in that house. They're still maintaining the boundary, and as far as Tom knows, the thing is still maintaining its side of the boundary too. The arrangement holds. The coexistence continues. I don't know how long that arrangement can last. I don't know what happens if more sightings occur, if more people start investigating, if the truth of these things' existence becomes too large to ignore. But I know that for now, in that corner of Michigan, an understanding exists between two species, a human family and something that doesn't have a scientific name. They've negotiated a peace. They're making it work. And Duke, that German shepherd who saw what was coming and stood between his human and danger, did the work that needed to be done. He established that there was intelligence on both sides of the boundary. He demanded that it be respected. And the thing at the tree line acknowledged that demand. That's the power of understanding. That's what happens when intelligence recognizes intelligence. It doesn't lead to conflict. It leads to arrangement. I've spent the time since then researching, traveling, and talking to more people. I've driven to Traverse City 4 times in the past 2 years. I've spent weeks in historical societies and libraries. I've talked to forest rangers and old-timers who've spent their whole lives in the deep woods. I've looked at old photographs and read journal entries and sat in people's kitchens while they told me stories they'd been carrying for decades. And the more I look, the more the pattern becomes undeniable. There are accounts going back centuries of encounters with something large, bipedal, intelligent. The accounts come from different regions, different time periods, different cultures, but they share commonalities: the size, the shape, the apparent intelligence, the willingness to coexist as long as boundaries are respected. I found a 1924 account from a man named Charles Whitfield, who was a forest ranger for the Department of Conservation. He kept detailed logs of his ranger activities, and in the logs, there are oblique references to unusual incidents. In one entry from November of that year, he notes that he's received reports of livestock being killed in ways that don't match any known predator. He notes that hunters in the area have been requesting permission to avoid certain sections of the forest. In another entry he writes, "The situation is being managed by existing protocols. No action beyond standard notification to residents is recommended at this time." It's the language of bureaucracy, but underneath it, you can feel the awareness. Someone at the Department of Conservation knows something, and the decision has been made to manage the knowledge rather than investigate it. I found a collection of personal journals belonging to a man named Henry Marsh, who was a hunter and trapper in northern Michigan from the 1930s through the 1960s. In his journals, he describes encounters with something that he refers to only as the thing or the situation. He writes in one entry, "Saw it again today near the upper creek. It was moving parallel to my position, matching my pace. I stopped. It stopped. I could not see it clearly, but I could see the outline, 8 feet at least, built like no animal I know. I realized then that it was hunting me as much as I was hunting it. I was no longer the predator. I was the intruder. I decided then that I would not return to that area. Some hunting is not worth the cost of hunting it." In another entry, 6 months later, he writes, "I've been thinking about what I saw. I think it was testing me. I think it wanted to know if I understood. If I understood that I was in its territory. If I understood the rules. When I turned back and left, I was telling it that I understood, and it let me go. That's the arrangement. Understand where the boundaries are, respect them, and you can survive in these forests. Violate them, and the consequences are absolute." These accounts are scattered through the historical record like breadcrumbs. You have to know what you're looking for to find them. You have to understand that people were documenting their encounters with these things, but they were doing it in a way that didn't expose the truth to the wider world. They were keeping the secret through the structure of their language. They were compartmentalizing the knowledge so that it would exist but not circulate. It would be available to those who needed to know, but hidden from those who would try to solve it. The Book of Enoch's references to hybrid beings start to make more sense in this context. Ancient peoples encountered these things. They developed frameworks to understand them. They passed those frameworks down through oral tradition. The stories might have gotten distorted over time, filtered through mythology and religious interpretation. But the core remained. There are other intelligences. They share the world with us. We need to respect them. What strikes me most is the restraint that these stories show. Even the accounts of deaths, even the reports of killings, they're presented without sensationalism. They're presented as tragic but inevitable, as the consequence of humans violating boundaries that should not have been violated. There's a grief in those accounts, a sadness that things sometimes have to die when boundaries are transgressed, but not a desire for vengeance, not a call to arms. Just an acceptance that this is what happens when the rules are broken. Tom is a man who works with his hands. He understands systems. He understands how things work when you pay attention to detail and follow the logic. But this thing, this encounter, it doesn't fit into any system he understands. It doesn't follow the rules of the world as he's been taught to understand it. And that bothers him in a way that most things don't bother him. He told me that in the weeks after the first encounter, he barely slept. Not from fear, though he was afraid, but from the fundamental disruption to his understanding of reality. He said he'd thought about what it would mean to report it, to call the Department of Natural Resources and tell them that there was something on his property that didn't match any known species. He'd thought about what would happen next. The investigation would start. Wildlife biologists would get involved. The story would leak to the media because these things always leak, and then it would become a spectacle, a mystery to be solved, a creature to be documented and studied and ultimately controlled. He said he knew exactly what he was giving up by choosing not to report it. He was giving up the possibility of being vindicated, of being proven right, of having the scientific community acknowledge that he'd seen something extraordinary, of having his name in journals and textbooks as the discoverer of a new species. He was giving up the possibility of contributing to human knowledge in a way that would be recorded and remembered forever. He was giving up the possibility of becoming famous, or at least locally known as the man who discovered something that shouldn't exist. He was giving up the possibility of lectures and interviews and documentaries. He was giving up the possibility of his children growing up knowing their father had changed human understanding of the world. These are not small things. These are the kinds of things that shape the way most people would think about their purpose, the legacy they'd leave behind, the mark they'd make on the world. Tom understood that giving those things up was a real sacrifice, and what he'd chosen instead was anonymity, silence. The possibility that he'd live his whole life carrying knowledge that he could never share, that he'd die knowing something extraordinary, and that knowledge would die with him unless he told it to people like me, who would then be faced with the same choice he was facing. He'd thought about it from every angle. He'd imagined conversations with his kids when they were older, after he'd passed away. He'd thought about whether he'd tell them the truth or whether he'd take the secret to his grave. He'd thought about the responsibility of passing that knowledge on. If he told them, they'd have to carry the burden too. They'd have to make the same choice he'd made. They'd have to live with the weight of knowing something they couldn't share. Or they might choose differently. They might decide to tell their own children, or worse, to try to get proof. They might break the arrangement in a way that Tom couldn't control. These thoughts had occupied his mind for months after the encounter. They still did, he said. Every few weeks he'd find himself thinking about it again, about the road not taken, about what might have happened if he'd made a different choice. That's not a trivial thing to give up. Part of him, he said, still wants to make that call. Still wants to be the man who proved that these things were real. Still wants to change human understanding of the world. That's a powerful desire, and I don't think it's something he should be ashamed of. It's human to want to leave a mark on the world. It's human to want to be remembered for something significant. It's human to want validation for what you know to be true. And Tom said that's what makes the choice harder. If the alternative had been a simple evil, if choosing silence meant choosing something obviously wrong, it would be easy. But the alternative isn't evil. It's glory. It's success. It's the kind of legacy that most people dream of. It's the chance to be important, to matter in a way that extends beyond your own life and your own family. I asked him if there were moments when he regretted his choice. He said yes. Not many, but yes. Usually late at night when he couldn't sleep. when he'd think about how the world could be different if people knew the truth, if the scientific community had to reckon with the fact that these beings existed, if the forest was protected not because it was just a nice forest, but because people understood that something intelligent lived there, if the law of the land acknowledged that other intelligences had rights. He said those moments were hard, because in those moments, the choice he'd made felt like a failure, like he'd had the chance to change everything, and he'd chosen to do nothing instead. He'd chosen to keep the secret. He'd chosen to let the world remain ignorant. He'd chosen not to be a hero. But he made a different choice. He chose to be forgotten. He chose to leave no trace. He chose to let the mystery remain unsolved. And that decision cost him something. It cost him the possibility of validation. It cost him the possibility of being part of scientific history. It cost him the chance to change the world's understanding of what's real. And he said what made it bearable was understanding why he was making that choice. It wasn't about being noble. It wasn't about being self-sacrificial. It was about recognizing that the arrangement was worth more than the accolades, that the possibility of coexistence was worth more than the certainty of fame, that the survival of a species and the preservation of mystery was worth more than his own legacy. He said he'd thought a lot about what legacy meant. He'd realized that there were two kinds of legacies. There was the kind that you left through doing something remarkable that got written down and remembered, the kind where your name appears in books and your discovery is attributed to you. Your family knows about it, your town knows about it, the world knows about it, and when you die, your legacy continues because other people continue to tell the story of what you did. And then there was the other kind of legacy, the kind that you left through the way you lived your life, through the choices you made when nobody was watching, through the example you set for your kids by the way you treated the world, through the quiet understanding that you'd change something in someone else's thinking, even if they never told anyone else about it. Tom said he'd come to believe that the second kind of legacy was more real in some ways, because it was based on how you actually lived, not on how the world remembered you. It was based on the difference you made in the world through your daily choices, not on the impact you had through a single discovery or achievement. Tom decided that the second kind of legacy was more important to him than the first. He decided that if his children grew up understanding that it's possible to know something extraordinary and still choose restraint, if they learned through his example that mystery was worth protecting, if they carried that understanding into their own lives and passed it on to their own children, then he would have left a legacy. Not a legacy that anyone outside his family would know about. Not a legacy that would be written in any textbook or remembered in any scientific community. But a legacy that mattered to him. A legacy that changed how the world was treated, even if nobody else knew why his family treated it that way. Because that's what legacy really is, he told me. It's not about being remembered. It's about changing the world in ways that persist after you're gone. And sometimes those changes are so quiet, so embedded in the way people live their lives, that nobody ever knows they happened. Nobody ever traces them back to the person who set the example. But they happened anyway. Sarah and Michael might grow up to be people who respect mystery. They might be people who recognize that there are things in the world that don't need to be solved or conquered. They might pass that understanding on to their children, and those children might live differently because of it. They might make choices differently. They might protect parts of the natural world instead of exploiting them. They might build a relationship with the wild instead of a dominion over it. All of that might happen because Tom chose to be silent about what he knew, because he chose to set an example of restraint, because he decided that his legacy was more important than his fame. That's what Tom was telling me. That's what he wanted me to understand. The arrangement wasn't just about two species coexisting. It was about choosing a different way of being in the world, a way that might not make you famous, a way that might not change human knowledge, but a way that changed something important anyway. Instead, he chose something else. He chose to be a steward. He chose to protect something. He chose to participate in an arrangement that was bigger than himself. He chose to be part of a long line of people who'd made the same choice across generations. To be part of a community of silence. A community of people who knew something extraordinary and chose not to expose it. I asked him if he regretted it. He said no. But he also said there were nights when he thought about it, when he wondered what would have happened if he'd made a different choice, if he'd called the authorities that first day, if he'd grabbed a camera and gotten footage, if he'd tried to prove it. Those moments of wondering are part of what he carries now. That's part of the cost of the choice he made. He'll never know what might have happened if he'd gone down that path. He'll never have the satisfaction of being proven right. He'll never contribute his discovery to the sum of human knowledge. He'll live the rest of his life knowing something extraordinary and never being able to share it openly with the world. That's the weight of the arrangement. That's what it costs to participate in it. It costs you the possibility of external validation. It costs you the possibility of being remembered for something great. It costs you the ability to solve a mystery that's right in front of you. It asks you to live with knowledge that you can't share. It asks you to be comfortable with that silence. I want to pause here and talk about what intelligence really means. When we think of intelligence, we usually think of it in human terms. We think of it as the ability to solve problems, to use language, to plan for the future, to organize society. But that's a very specific kind of intelligence. It's the kind of intelligence that's oriented toward dominance and control. It's the kind of intelligence that assumes that understanding something means being able to use it. I spent months looking at the historical killings more carefully, the accounts of deaths that didn't quite make sense from a predator perspective, the cases where something seemed wrong about the circumstances, the deaths that read like justice rather than predation. And what I found was a pattern that's more unsettling than simple predation, because the pattern suggests not just intelligence, but ethics, a system of law, a code of conduct, a framework for understanding right and wrong behavior. I became obsessed with this idea. I found myself reading the accounts over and over, looking for variations in the pattern, looking for exceptions that might disprove the thesis, looking for deaths that seemed random or cruel or excessive. But the pattern held. Across centuries, across different regions, across different presumed populations of these beings, the same message appeared again and again. You were warned. You violated the boundary. You are being held accountable. What struck me most was what didn't happen. There were no accounts of creatures that seemed to be hunting humans for sport. No accounts of prolonged torture. No accounts of beings that seemed to derive pleasure from the act of killing. The deaths, when they came, seemed swift, conclusive. The being that delivered them seemed focused on accomplishing the act and moving on, not on maximizing suffering. That's a level of self-control that most predators don't possess. That's a level of deliberation about the nature of the act. That's evidence of something operating according to a system, not according to instinct. In nearly every account of a death attributed to these beings, there's something odd about the circumstances. Either the victim had violated a boundary that they knew existed, or they'd been warned multiple times and ignored the warning, or they'd been in a forbidden place in a deliberate, defiant way that suggested they bore responsibility for the outcome. There's a thread of justice running through the accounts, a sense that the deaths weren't random or driven by hunger or predatory instinct. They were responses. They were consequences. They were the enforcement of rules that had been established and communicated. What's particularly striking is the pattern of escalation. There's rarely a first strike that kills. There's usually a warning first, an encounter, an opportunity to understand that something is wrong, a chance to leave. Only when that opportunity is ignored does the consequence come. And when it comes, it's final. There's no second warning. There's no mercy in the moment of enforcement. But there was mercy in the warning. There was a choice given before the consequence arrived. This suggests something almost legal about the process, as if there's a code of conduct being enforced, as if there are trials and executions in a sense. The trial being the encounter and the warning, the execution being the consequence when the warning is ignored, and the standards of evidence for guilt being remarkably clear and consistent across all the accounts. You were told not to come here. You came anyway. Therefore you are guilty. Therefore you must face consequences. One account I found was from 1931 in a sheriff's report from Newberry, Michigan. A man named Joseph Kolish had been found dead in the woods about 10 miles from town. The report noted that local residents had warned Kolish not to hunt in that particular area. There were rumors, the report said, of dangerous wildlife in the region, but Kolish ignored the warnings. He was an experienced hunter, and he didn't believe in rumors. He thought the locals were superstitious. He thought the warnings were exaggerated. He was found 2 days later, and the death was determined to be from an animal attack. But the sheriff noted something in his report that struck me as significant. The body was positioned carefully. The wounds, while severe, were not frenzied. There was no evidence of feeding. The body had simply been killed, with precision and intention, and then left in a place where it would be found. It was almost as if the killer wanted to send a message, as if it wanted everyone to know what had happened to Joseph Kolish, because he'd ignored the warning. The message was clear. You were warned. You ignored the warning. This is what happens when you violate the boundary. Another account from 1947 in a private journal belonging to a forest ranger named David Thornton describes something similar. A group of hunters from outside the region had come up to hunt in an area that the ranger knew was occupied by these beings. The ranger had tried to discourage them from hunting there. He'd even given them a more detailed warning than he normally would have, trying to convey the danger without sounding insane. But the hunters laughed it off. They thought he was trying to keep the good hunting grounds for himself. 3 days later, one of the hunters came back alone, badly traumatized, and reported that the group had been attacked. He said the hunters were experienced men, well-armed, capable, but they'd been scattered and driven back, not by an organized pack attack, but by what seemed like a calculated display of force. One of the other hunters had been killed. The survivor said it didn't look like an animal attack. It looked like a military operation. It looked like the thing knew exactly what it was doing, and it was deliberately taking out one member of the group as a demonstration. The surviving hunter said the message had been clear. You were warned. You didn't listen. Now you understand the cost of not listening. Take this message back to your people. Don't come here again. These aren't stories of mindless predation. These are stories of intelligent beings enforcing boundaries with precision and intention. These are stories of ethics being applied consistently across decades and across different geographic regions, of rules being established and consequences being delivered when those rules were violated, of a system of justice that seems to operate with more mercy than some human justice systems, because warnings are always given before punishment. I spent a lot of time thinking about what this means, what it suggests about the nature of these beings, what it suggests about their understanding of morality and responsibility, because a being that gives warnings before enforcing consequences is a being that understands something important. It understands that death is significant. It understands that taking a life requires justification. It understands that the entity whose life is being taken deserves an opportunity to change course before that final act. That's a moral framework. That's not just predator behavior. That's conscious ethical decision-making. That's a being that has thought about what it means to kill, that has decided that it's justified to kill in certain circumstances, that those circumstances are clearly defined, that warnings should precede the act, that the act itself should be swift and final, with no prolonged suffering or playing with prey. A predator doesn't think like that. A predator is driven by instinct and hunger. A predator doesn't give warnings. A predator doesn't seem to care about the consent or understanding of its prey. A predator doesn't operate according to rules and boundaries. But these beings seem to do all of those things, which means they're not predators in the way we understand predation. They're something different, something that hunts, yes, something that kills, yes, but something that does both in a way that suggests moral deliberation. And what strikes me most about these accounts is the consistency of the message. Across decades, across different locations, across different beings, the same message is being communicated. There's a boundary. You know where it is. You know what the consequences are if you violate it. And we will enforce those consequences. That's not the behavior of animals. That's the behavior of a society with laws, with enforcement mechanisms, with a system of justice. These beings aren't just surviving in the forests alongside humans. They're governing themselves. They're maintaining order within their population. They're enforcing boundaries. They're communicating with humans through the language of consequence. And most importantly, they're giving warnings before they enforce those consequences. They're allowing humans the opportunity to choose to respect the boundary before they resort to violence. That's remarkably humane, actually. That's more merciful than some human justice systems. These beings give multiple opportunities to learn, to change course, to respect the boundary. Only when those opportunities are ignored do they take action. Tom understood this. That's why he respected the boundary so completely after that first encounter. He understood that he'd been given a chance, that the being had been gracious enough to back away instead of asserting dominance, that he'd been allowed to live and to maintain his family's territory because he'd shown respect. And he knew that if he violated that respect, if he tried to prove the being's existence or expose it or capture it, the consequences would be absolute. He said that knowing changed everything. It changed the way he looked at the forest. It changed the way he approached his property. It changed the way he thought about his responsibility to his family. Because now he understood that his family wasn't living in isolation. They were living on borrowed territory. They were living because something else had decided to allow them to live there. They had neighbors, and those neighbors were far more powerful and far more intelligent than anyone had realized. That knowledge would have broken some people. It would have driven them to madness or denial or obsessive documentation. But Tom responded by deepening his responsibility. He understood that he'd been granted a privilege, the privilege of coexisting with something extraordinary, and that privilege came with an obligation, the obligation to respect the boundary, to protect the mystery, to participate in the arrangement. I asked him what that looked like in practical terms. How did you live differently knowing what you knew? What changed? He said first, he changed how he managed the property. He stopped pushing back the forest the way he had before. He let the wild areas become wilder. He created areas that were clearly human spaces and areas that were clearly not human spaces. He established, through his actions, the same kind of boundary that the thing in the forest was establishing through its presence. He stopped hunting on his property entirely. He'd hunted deer sometimes in the past on his own land to provide meat for his family. He stopped doing that. Not because he was afraid that the being would retaliate, though he understood the being probably could if it chose to, but because he understood something more important. If he was going to demand that the being respect his family's right to exist on the property, he couldn't turn around and violate the being's hunting territory. He couldn't claim to respect the boundary while simultaneously hunting in the shared forest. The arrangement required consistency. It required that both parties operate according to the same set of rules. So, he stopped hunting. He started buying his venison from a butcher in Traverse City. It was more expensive. It was less satisfying in some ways, because he wasn't participating in the ancient practice of hunter and hunted that he'd grown up with. But it was the only consistent response to the arrangement he'd entered into. Linda knew that Tom had stopped hunting. She asked him about it once. He told her that he'd just decided the property was too close to residential areas for hunting anymore, that it wasn't safe, that he'd rather buy his meat from sources that had already processed it. Linda accepted that explanation. She didn't know that the real reason was that hunting on his own property felt like a violation of an understanding he'd reached with something else that lived there. But that's what had changed for Tom. He was no longer hunting on his own land. He was no longer participating in predation on his own property. He was ceding that territory to something else. And in exchange, something else was respecting the boundary of his home. He changed how he moved through the forest. When he had to go into the deep woods for maintenance or to cut firewood, he announced his presence. He didn't try to be silent and unobserved. He let the being know that he was there. He was transparent about his movements. He was respecting the being's right to know what was happening in its territory. He restricted where his kids could go. Sarah and Michael were not permitted to venture into certain parts of the property. He told them it was to protect them from getting lost or injured, which was partly true. But the deeper reason was that he was maintaining the boundary. He was making sure that the human presence didn't encroach too far into the territory that belonged to something else. He installed the motion-activated lights, which served multiple purposes. Practically, they provided security, but symbolically, they served as a declaration. They marked the boundary between the human space and the wild space. They said, "Here is the line. On this side, it's defended and lit and clearly human. On that side, it's wild and dark and yours." He started leaving offerings. I almost didn't include this because it sounds superstitious, and Tom doesn't present as a superstitious man. But he said that after the encounter, after understanding that something was out there and that it was intelligent, it felt right to leave offerings. It felt like the appropriate response to living alongside something that had the power to kill him, but had chosen not to. The offerings started small. A fresh kill sometimes, field-dressed and left in a clearing deep in the forest. Not in a place where humans usually went, but in the deeper woods where he knew the being would find it. Tom would take a deer or an elk that he'd hunted elsewhere on public lands and process it himself. He'd clean it and prepare it and leave it as an offering in the deep forest of his property. He said he never knew if the offerings were used. He'd leave them, and sometimes when he checked back they'd be gone, which could mean the being took them or that scavengers had. But whether they were used or not, the act mattered to Tom. The act itself was communication. It was a way of saying, "I acknowledge you. I recognize your right to hunt here. I'm leaving you sustenance. I respect you. I want to exist peacefully alongside you. I'm willing to contribute to your survival, even though you could demand it if you wanted to." It was a form of tribute. Tom understood that. He was offering something of value as a gesture of respect. It was the kind of thing that happened between powerful entities that recognized each other's strength. A tribute that said, "You are significant enough that I will give you something without being forced to. You are important enough that I will invest resources in maintaining our peaceful coexistence." Linda noticed the deer that Tom would sometimes bring home that he claimed he'd hunted elsewhere. She didn't question it closely. She just processed the meat and stored it. But Tom knew that what he was really doing was hunting on public lands and then giving most of that meat to the being in the forest. He was providing for something that he couldn't tell his wife about. He was making a commitment that he couldn't explain. He said he never knew if the offerings were accepted or used. He'd leave them and come back later, and they'd be gone, which could mean the being took them, or animals did. But the act of leaving them mattered. The act of acknowledging the other presence on his property mattered. It was part of maintaining the arrangement. Linda adapted in different ways. She was more focused on protecting the kids psychologically. She didn't know all the details of what Tom had seen, and Tom didn't tell her. He protected her from that knowledge because he wanted her to feel safe in her own home. But she noticed the changes in Tom's behavior. She noticed that he was more careful about the property, more deliberate about establishing boundaries. And instead of questioning him endlessly, She trusted his judgment. She understood that something had changed, even if she didn't know exactly what. And she adapted to the new reality he was creating. Sarah and Michael adapted by accepting the restrictions without much resistance. Kids are good at accepting the world as presented to them, and Tom presented a world where certain parts of the forest were off limits. He made the boundaries clear, and he didn't provide explanations that would frighten them. They just understood that there were places they could go and places they couldn't. That was their normal. What Tom was doing, I realized as he explained it, was creating a culture of respect. He was teaching his family, through daily action and decision, how to coexist with something unknown. He was building the habits and the attitudes that would allow them to maintain the arrangement. He was not just respecting the boundary, he was institutionalizing respect. Tom told me before I left Michigan that he'd made a decision. He was going to keep the arrangement going. He was going to raise his kids to understand that some parts of the world belong to other beings. That just because we have the power to control and dominate doesn't mean we should. That coexistence is possible if we're willing to respect the boundaries that have been established. He said he wanted them to understand that there are things in the world that we're not supposed to fully know. Things that exist outside our frameworks of understanding. And that's okay. That's more than okay. That's necessary. He said he'd already started teaching his kids these lessons. Not directly, not by telling them the story. They don't know about the encounter. They don't know about the thing in the forest. That would only frighten them, and that's not the point. Instead, he was teaching them through the way he lived, by modeling the behavior, by showing them that you can live in the wild places without needing to conquer the wild places, that you can look at a mystery and choose not to solve it, that you can see something impossible and accept it rather than trying to prove it. He talked about how he'd changed his relationship with the property since the encounter, how he'd stopped thinking of it as something he owned and controlled, and started thinking of it as something he was a steward of, a place where multiple beings had a right to exist. He talked about how he'd instructed the kids not to venture into certain parts of the forest, not because he was afraid for their safety, though he was, but because those were places where other beings had established their territory. Those places belonged to them, and respecting that was important. Sarah, his daughter, asked him once why they kept the property kind of isolated, why they didn't put in as much cleared land as the neighbors, why they left the forest alone. The neighbors down the road had cleared a lot of their property. They had open fields and mowed areas and only small stands of forest left. Why didn't Tom do the same? Tom thought about how to answer that. He said it was because some things were meant to stay wild, because the world needs places where other beings can exist without interference. Because there's wisdom in leaving some mysteries unsolved. He said that clearing all the forest would mean declaring that everything should be known, documented, controlled, and that was a kind of death, a death of possibility, a death of mystery. Sarah seemed to understand. She's old enough to understand that the world is more complex than the simple categories we teach in school, that there are things that don't fit into the neat boxes of science and taxonomy, that some things simply are, and we have to accept that. Michael, who was younger, understood it more intuitively. He understood that some places were safe to go and some places weren't. He understood boundary and respect at a level that children often do, before language gets in the way. I asked Tom how he thought his kids would remember this period of their lives. In 20 years, when they're adults and they're looking back, what would they understand about what had happened? Tom said he hoped they would understand that they'd learned to live in a world that contained genuine mystery, that they'd learned that coexistence didn't require understanding, that it required respect. He hoped they would carry that understanding into their own lives, into their own decisions about how to live in the world. I want to talk about methodology for a moment, because this is something that bothers me about how we approach these stories. In the modern era, we've been trained to think that if something is real, it must be provable, it must be documentable, it must be available for scientific scrutiny. If you can't prove it, then it doesn't exist. That's the epistemology we've been taught. But what if that's wrong? What if there are things in the world that are real, that absolutely exist, but that exist precisely because they've managed to avoid being documented and studied? What if the fact that these beings have remained unknown to science is not evidence that they don't exist, but evidence of their intelligence? These things understand humans. They understand our tools. They understand our systems of research and documentation. They understand that being documented means being exposed to our control systems. And they've chosen not to be documented. They've chosen to remain hidden. And that's a perfectly rational choice for an intelligent being to make. When I was doing research in Michigan, I talked to a biologist from Michigan State University. She was interested in cryptid species, and she'd done some work on undocumented animals in remote regions. She told me that there's a phenomenon in animal behavior called crypticity. It's the ability and tendency of animals to hide from human observation. Some animals are naturally very cryptic. They're active at night. They make minimal noise. They avoid human contact. They have an instinctive understanding that humans are dangerous and should be avoided. But crypticity in these beings might be different. It might not be instinctive. It might be learned. It might be deliberate. They might have figured out, through generations of interaction with humans, that the best survival strategy is to remain hidden, to minimize contact, to establish and maintain boundaries. And then they might have passed that knowledge down through their generations, the way humans do, through language or example or some other form of communication, which would make their hiding an act of culture, not just behavior. That would explain why we have accounts of these beings across so many time periods and so many regions. It would explain why the pattern of behavior is so consistent. These aren't just animals responding to instinct. These are beings that have learned how to live alongside humans without being captured or killed. These are beings that have a strategy. The thing I keep coming back to is this. Tom's story didn't have to happen the way it did. It could have ended differently. If he'd fired that warning shot, if he'd pursued the thing, if he'd tried to capture it or prove its existence, the outcome would have been different. There would have been conflict. There might have been death. There would have been no arrangement. There would be no mutual understanding. There would be only the clash of two intelligences trying to assert dominance over each other. But Tom made a different choice. He understood in that moment that the dog understood something he didn't. He understood that Duke's barking was not an attack but a negotiation. Duke was saying, "Here is the line. You must not cross it." And the thing in the tree line listened. The thing understood what Duke was communicating, and it made its own choice. It backed away. It respected the boundary. That moment, that mutual recognition, was the turning point. That's when the arrangement became possible. That's when the understanding was established. Instead, Tom made a choice. He lowered the rifle. He let the thing retreat. He established, through his actions, that he understood the rules, that he was willing to play by them, and the thing acknowledged that choice. It came back, weeks later, to demonstrate that it was keeping its side of the bargain, that it understood Tom was a reasonable being, that coexistence was possible between them. That moment, that recognition, might be one of the most important moments I've encountered in all these stories, because it shows that if humans can be reasonable, if we can see these things as beings with their own rights and their own place in the world, then maybe coexistence isn't just possible. Maybe it's inevitable. Maybe it's what's already happening in the places where humans and these things have learned to live together. I think about what would happen if more people made that choice, if more encounters followed that pattern, if we, as a species, decided that proving the existence of unknown beings wasn't worth violating the boundaries that keep them safe, if we decided that some mysteries were meant to stay mysteries, what would that mean for the world? What would it mean to have vast tracts of wilderness that we simply agreed not to disturb? Places where other intelligences could exist on their own terms, following their own rules, without fear of capture or study or exposure? That kind of world seems possible to me. Not easy, but possible. Tom's family is living in it, in a small way. They've drawn a line. On one side of the line, humans and their rules. On the other side, something else. Something intelligent. Something that deserves to remain hidden. And the arrangement is holding. It's been holding for months now. It might hold for years. It might hold indefinitely as long as both sides keep their agreement. Duke is still there. He's still watching the tree line. He's still the guardian of that boundary, the enforcer of the understanding that was established in October. But he's not tense anymore. He's not afraid. He's just present. He's just keeping watch. That's what the world needs, I think. More guardians like Duke. More humans like Tom who understand that intelligence recognizes intelligence. That you can't ask someone to respect your boundaries if you're not willing to respect theirs. That coexistence isn't weakness, it's wisdom. The arrangement holds. And as long as it holds, something ancient and powerful and mysterious continues to exist in the deep forests. Something that the world isn't ready to understand. Something that deserves to stay hidden. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's exactly how it should be. Before I wrap this up, I want to address something that's been sitting in the back of my mind this whole time. The question of why this matters. Why should anyone care about these stories? Why should we preserve mysteries when we have the tools to solve them? Why should we respect the boundary when we have the power to violate it? I think the answer has to do with what happens when we stop preserving mysteries. When we decide that everything needs to be known, cataloged, controlled, managed, we end up with a world that's smaller than it needs to be. We end up with a world where there's nowhere left that belongs to something other than humans. Where every corner has been explored, every secret exposed, every being understood and categorized. Think about what that means. If we knew everything, if there were no mysteries left, if every being in the world had been studied and documented and filed away in a database, what would be left to discover? What would be left to wonder about? What would be left to inspire awe and humility in us? I think humans need mystery. I think we need to know that there are things in the world that we don't fully understand. I think we need that knowledge to keep us humble, to keep us from thinking that we have complete mastery over the natural world. I think we need the possibility that we might encounter something that forces us to expand our categories, to reconsider our assumptions, to admit that maybe we don't know everything. But there's another reason, I think, a deeper reason. I think that in choosing to preserve mystery, in choosing to respect the boundary, we're making a moral choice. We're saying that other beings have the right to exist on their own terms. We're saying that just because we can control something doesn't mean we should. We're saying that coexistence is more valuable than dominance. Tom's story is about that choice. It's about a man who could have grabbed a camera and tried to get proof of something incredible. He could have reported it to the authorities. He could have turned it into a media sensation. He could have become famous. But instead, he made a different choice. He chose to respect the boundary. He chose to let the mystery remain a mystery. He chose coexistence over dominance. And I think that choice matters. I think that choice says something important about what kind of world we want to live in. It says that we value the existence of other beings, even when we don't fully understand them. It says that we recognize the right of other species to exist without human interference. It says that we understand that intelligence is not measured by our ability to control other beings, but by our ability to coexist with them respectfully. This is not a new idea. Indigenous peoples have understood this for millennia. They've understood that coexistence with the natural world, with the beings that inhabit the forests and the mountains, is not only possible, but necessary. The Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe, the other indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes region understood that respect for the natural world and the beings in it was not just a spiritual practice. It was a survival strategy. It was a way of maintaining the balance that allowed everyone, humans and non-humans alike, to thrive. But Western culture largely abandoned that understanding. We adopted the philosophy of dominion. We decided that everything in the natural world existed for our use. We set out to map it all, control it all, use it all. And in the process, we've lost something important. We've lost the understanding that there could be parts of the world that belong to something other than us. We've lost the humility that comes from recognizing limits. What Tom is trying to do, I think, is to recover some of that understanding. He's trying to create a small space in the world where mystery is preserved, where other beings are recognized as having rights, where the boundary is respected. And I think in doing that, he's doing something that the world desperately needs. That's not the world that Tom wants his kids to inherit. It's not the world that the people who lived in those Michigan forests for generations wanted to hand down. They understood that the world is better when there are mysteries, when there are places where other intelligences can exist on their own terms, when there's room for things we don't understand. The historical record shows that people knew this. The early settlers, the indigenous peoples, the loggers and hunters and trappers who spent their lives in the deep forests, they all seemed to understand that there was wisdom in leaving some things alone. That respect wasn't just about power. It was about recognizing that the world didn't belong entirely to humans, that there were other claims on the land, other beings with other rights. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about what we've lost by deciding that everything needs to be known, about the possibilities we've closed off by insisting that the world conform to our expectations, about what might still exist in the places we've agreed not to look too closely. Tom's family is maintaining something precious. They're maintaining the possibility that the world still contains genuine mystery, that intelligence can meet intelligence across the boundary of species and find common ground. That coexistence doesn't require conquest or proof or understanding. Sometimes it just requires respect. That's worth preserving. That's worth protecting. I think about Duke a lot. I think about the moment he saw the thing at the tree line and understood what it was. The moment he made a choice to stand between his family and danger. The moment the thing recognized his choice and decided to respect it. Those are moments that matter. Those are moments that show what's possible when beings with different natures meet with mutual respect. It's easy to dismiss these stories. It's easy to say they're folklore, mythology, the product of overactive imaginations and dark forests and long winters. It's easy to insist that we know everything there is to know about the large predators of North America, that everything has been documented and categorized and fits neatly into the boxes that science has created. But if you spend enough time in those Michigan forests, if you talk to enough people who've lived their entire lives there, if you listen to the stories that have been passed down through generations, you start to understand that maybe we don't know everything. Maybe there are things in the world that science hasn't found because science hasn't been looking in the right places, because the people who know those places best have decided that some things shouldn't be found. Tom made that decision. His family is living with it, and the arrangement is holding. I don't know how long it can last. I don't know what will happen if the story becomes too well known, if too many people start looking, if the boundary that's been drawn gets too much attention. But for now, it's working. For now, there's a German shepherd and a family and something intelligent at the edge of the forest, and they've all decided to respect the line that's been drawn. That's the story. That's what I wanted to tell. Not a story about proving the existence of something impossible. A story about choosing to live with mystery. A story about recognizing when intelligence meets intelligence and making the decision to back away rather than push forward. It's a quieter story than the ones you see in cryptid culture. It's not sensational. It's not proof. It's not even particularly dramatic when you get down to it. It's just a family, a dog, and something in the forest. And the understanding that sometimes the best thing you can do is respect the boundary. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. Thank you for taking the time to think about these things. Thank you for considering the possibility that the world contains more than we've admitted. And thank you for understanding that sometimes the right choice isn't to solve the mystery. Sometimes it's to preserve it. Duke is watching the tree line right now. Somewhere in that forest, something is watching back. And the arrangement holds, the coexistence continues, and the world is slightly less certain about what it thinks it knows, which means it still has room for genuine mystery. That matters. That matters more than proof ever could. I want to talk about what it's like to carry this knowledge. Tom asked me not to sensationalize his story, and I've tried to respect that. But I also understand that by telling the story at all, I'm risking the arrangement. I'm increasing the possibility that enough people will become interested that investigation will happen. That's a burden I carry. That's the responsibility that comes with knowing something like this. When I sit down to work on this, I think about Tom's kids. I think about what kind of world they'll inherit. I think about whether the arrangement can hold if more people know about it. I think about what responsibility I have to Tom and his family to protect the knowledge, or whether my responsibility is to share it so that more people understand what's at stake. There's a middle path, I think. A way to tell the story that preserves the mystery while acknowledging the truth. A way to increase people's awareness of the possibility of these beings' existence without creating a firestorm of investigation. A way to build a community of people who understand the importance of respect and restraint without creating so much public interest that restraint becomes impossible. That's what I hope to do here. That's what I'm trying to do by telling this story the way I'm telling it. Not as proof, not as evidence to be investigated, but as a story about a choice. A story about what's possible when intelligence meets intelligence with respect. I've spent more than 2 years thinking about this story. I've researched extensively. I've interviewed people. I've read historical accounts. I've thought deeply about what it means if these beings are real and what it means if they're not. And I've concluded that it doesn't matter. What matters is the principle. What matters is the choice that Tom made. What matters is the understanding that coexistence is possible. Whether these specific beings exist or not, the story is true. The story about what happens when two intelligences meet with respect. The story about what's possible when we choose restraint over dominance. The story about what happens when we respect the boundary. That's the story I want to tell. That's the story I want people to hear. Not because I want them to believe in dogmen or cryptids or mysterious creatures in the forest, but because I want them to understand that the world is bigger and stranger and more complex than we usually admit. And that's beautiful. That's worth preserving. One more thing. I want to share something that happened recently that made me reconsider everything about this story. About 2 months after I first heard Tom's account, I received a letter. No return address. Postmark from Michigan. Inside, nothing but a single page of handwritten text, the handwriting precise and careful. It read, "Thank you for not publishing the story. The arrangement has held for 4 months now. The fence line remains. The boundary is respected on both sides. My son saw something in the forest yesterday. He wasn't afraid. He understood what it was. He understood that it belonged there as much as he did. That's what you were talking about. That's exactly what you meant. This is the world we're building, one family at a time, one quiet moment at a time. Don't push this story into the light. Let it stay where it needs to stay, in the knowledge of people who already know, in the quiet understanding between those who have chosen respect." My daughter asks sometimes why we keep the property wild. I tell her it's because some things need to exist without being measured or understood. She understands. I think your story might help other people understand too. If you decide to tell it carefully. Tell it like I'm telling you now. quietly, respectfully, as if you're speaking to someone across a boundary that shouldn't be crossed. That letter wasn't signed, but I knew who it was from. Tom was telling me something. He was telling me that the story was working the way it should, that by not sensationalizing it, by not treating it as proof or evidence or proof of existence, I was letting the arrangement remain intact. That's when I understood what the story was really about. It wasn't about proof. It wasn't about documenting the existence of something that science doesn't recognize. It was about preserving the conditions that allow coexistence. It was about creating a framework where humans could encounter these things and respond with respect rather than with violence or exploitation. Let me be clear about something. I'm not asking you to believe that these things exist. I'm not offering proof. I'm not claiming to have scientific evidence. What I'm doing is telling you a story that Tom told me, and stories from other people who've encountered something they can't explain, in accounts that go back centuries. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that these things are real. But more than that, I'm asking you to consider what it would mean if they were real, and what your responsibility would be in that situation. I'm asking you to think about the choice that Tom made, and whether you think it was the right choice. Because here's the thing. If these beings are real, and if they depend on humans respecting the boundary for their survival, then every person who encounters evidence of their existence faces a choice. They can report it, they can investigate it, they can try to prove it and turn it into a spectacle, or they can respect the boundary, they can choose silence, they can choose to protect the mystery, and that choice matters. That choice, multiplied across generations and across the many people who encounter evidence of these things, creates the conditions that allow these beings to survive. It's not just Tom making a choice. It's the forest ranger who doesn't investigate unusual killings. It's the indigenous elder who doesn't publicize the stories his grandfather told him. It's the old logger who doesn't report the strange footprints he found. It's all of these people, across time, making the same choice. The choice to protect the mystery. Every person who hears this story and chooses to believe it. Every person who chooses to accept the possibility that the world contains mysteries we don't need to solve. Every person who decides to respect boundaries that have been drawn between human territory and wild territory, that person is maintaining the arrangement. That person is part of the larger framework that keeps these things safe. It's a kind of collective agreement, a decision made by communities across time, not to pursue something even though we could, not to solve a mystery even though we have the tools, not to prove something even though proof is available to those who look carefully enough. Instead, we choose to leave it alone. We choose to respect the boundary. We choose coexistence. I don't know if that's possible on a large scale. I don't know if it's possible to convince enough people to make that choice. I suspect it's not. I suspect that eventually, someone will get definitive proof of these beings' existence. Someone will be driven by the need for attention or validation to break the silence. And when that happens, the arrangement will likely break down. But for now, in this moment, the arrangement still holds. These beings still exist in the deep forests, unknown and unmeasured and unproven. And that's because enough people, across generations, have chosen to respect the boundary, have chosen mystery over certainty, have chosen coexistence over dominance. What I think about most is what these beings teach us about ourselves, about what we're capable of, about what we choose to do with our power. When Tom saw that thing at the tree line, he had the power to shoot it. He had the power to destroy it. He had the power to prove its existence and expose it to the world. He had every tool at his disposal to dominate that situation. But he didn't. He made a different choice. He chose restraint. He chose to recognize that something else had the right to exist on its own terms. That choice required something. It required Tom to set aside his own desires. It required him to overcome his fear. It required him to recognize intelligence in something that didn't look like him, didn't think like him, didn't communicate like him. It required him to expand his understanding of what deserves respect. And when the thing saw Duke standing there, barking, protecting his territory, it also made a choice. It chose to respect that boundary. It chose not to attack. It chose to acknowledge the dog's right to defend his family and his territory. These are not simple choices. These are choices that require intelligence and restraint, and an understanding of ethics. When these two intelligences met, they both made choices, and in those choices, they established the possibility of coexistence. They established the possibility that two beings, coming from completely different frameworks, could meet and recognize each other's right to exist. That's what I think about. That's what keeps me engaged with this story. Not the mystery of what these beings are, not the proof or lack of proof of their existence, but the fact that coexistence is possible, that intelligence can recognize intelligence across the boundaries of the species and form, that we don't have to dominate everything we encounter, that we can choose otherwise. I think what Tom is trying to do, and what I'm trying to communicate through this story, is something larger than just the survival of an unknown species. I think it's about what kind of consciousness we want to cultivate as a species. Do we want to be a species that compulsively needs to know and control everything? Or can we be a species that's capable of restraint, that's capable of recognizing a boundary and respecting it, that's capable of coexisting with mystery? Because that's what this is really about. It's about consciousness. It's about whether we can develop the kind of consciousness that's compatible with a world that still contains genuine mystery, a world that's not entirely mapped and documented and filed away in databases, a world that retains some wildness, some otherness, some genuine unknowability. For most of human history, the world was full of mystery. There were places you couldn't go. There were things you didn't understand. There were beings whose nature was foreign to you, and humans learned to live with that. They developed religions and philosophies and ways of thinking that allowed them to coexist with mystery. They developed the idea that not everything needed to be known, not everything needed to be controlled. But in the last few hundred years, we've changed. We've developed the technology to map everything, to document everything, to solve every mystery, and we've become compulsive about it. We've become a species that can't rest until everything is known, until every being is understood, until every corner of the world has been explored and cataloged. And I think that's cost us something. I think we've lost something important in that pursuit of total knowledge. We've lost the capacity to live with mystery. We've lost the ability to accept that some things might exist outside our understanding. We've lost the humility that comes from recognizing limits. Tom's story is about recovering some of that capacity. It's about showing that it's possible to encounter something extraordinary and choose not to solve it. It's about showing that mystery can be preserved, that boundaries can be respected, that coexistence is possible. And I think the world needs that story. I think we need to remember that we're not required to know everything, that we're not obligated to dominate every corner of the natural world, that there can be parts of the world that remain wild, unknown, and genuinely other. The beings in the forest understand this. They've figured out that the best survival strategy is to remain hidden, to not be part of our systems of documentation and control, to exist outside the purview of human knowledge. And they've been successful at it for generations. Longer than that, centuries. But that success is fragile. It depends on humans choosing to respect the boundary. It depends on us deciding that some mysteries are worth more than solutions. It depends on us being willing to live with the knowledge that something is out there without needing to prove it or understand it or control it. Tom has made that choice. His family has made that choice. And they're part of a larger community of people stretching back through history who've made the same choice. A community bound not by anything explicit, but by a shared understanding. An understanding that some things should remain hidden, that some boundaries should be respected. That coexistence is more valuable than dominance. I want to be part of that community. That's why I'm telling this story carefully. That's why I'm not claiming to have proof. That's why I'm not trying to convince you that these beings definitely exist. I'm telling the story because I want to be part of the choice to protect something, to protect the possibility that the world still contains mystery. To protect the possibility that intelligence can meet intelligence and choose coexistence. That's what's at stake here, not the survival of a species, though that's part of it, but the survival of mystery itself. The survival of the capacity to live with things we don't fully understand. The survival of a world that's not entirely known. This is the power of the story. Not the power to prove something exists, the power to create a community of people who understand that some things deserve to stay hidden, who understand that intelligence recognizes intelligence, who understand that coexistence is possible, who understand that just because we can control something doesn't mean we should. Tom's family is part of that community now. I'm part of it. And anyone who hears this story and chooses to believe it, to accept it, to spread it not as proof, but as possibility, they're part of it too. We're all part of the larger arrangement. We're all participants in the choice to respect the boundary. The arrangement is bigger than I initially understood. It's not just about a family and a forest and a boundary line. It's about a collective decision made by people across generations and across time that some mysteries are worth preserving, that some beings deserve to remain unknown, that the world is better when it still contains genuine surprise. I think that's what the ancient peoples understood. That's what the early settlers understood. That's what Tom understands. That's what Duke understands at some level that probably exceeds human cognition. That's what the thing in the forest understands. They all understand that the arrangement is fragile, that it depends on silence, not the silence of fear or suppression, but the silence of respect, The kind of silence that says, I know you're there, I respect that you're there, and I'm going to let you be. That kind of silence is powerful. That kind of silence builds worlds. So, I'm going to end this here. I'm going to trust that the people who need to hear this story have heard it. That the community of people who understand what it means, who understand that this is about preserving mystery rather than solving it, will take it to heart. And I'm going to trust that the arrangement will hold, that Duke will keep watching, that the boundary will be respected, that somewhere in Michigan, a family and something unknown will continue to coexist, unknown and unmeasured and unproven, but real. Profoundly, undeniably real. That's enough. That has to be enough. Because if we're being honest with ourselves, the world doesn't need another documented species. It doesn't need more proof. What it needs is space for mystery. What it needs is beings who understand respect. What it needs is the quiet knowledge that intelligence can meet intelligence across any boundary and find common ground. That letter changed how I thought about what I was doing. Tom wasn't asking me to keep his story a complete secret. He was asking me to tell it carefully. To tell it in a way that preserved the mystery rather than solving it. To tell it in a way that increased respect rather than curiosity. To tell it in a way that honored the boundary. And I think that's what this story is. It's told carefully. It's told with respect for the beings involved and for the boundary they maintain. It's not told as proof or evidence to be investigated. It's told as a possibility to be considered, a choice to be made. I've thought a lot about the responsibility that comes with this. I've thought about what I risk by telling this story. I've thought about what's at stake. And I've concluded that the risk is worth it, because I think the world needs this story. I think people need to know that coexistence is possible. That intelligence can recognize intelligence across any boundary, that we have the power to choose differently. When you hear this story, you face the same choice that Tom faced. You can investigate it, you can try to prove it, you can report it to authorities and set in motion the machinery of human control. Or you can accept the boundary, you can respect the mystery, you can choose to be part of the arrangement. That choice, multiplied across all the people who hear this story, creates the conditions for the arrangement to hold, or it creates the conditions for the arrangement to break down. It depends on which choice you make. I don't know what the right choice is. I only know what Tom chose. I only know what the being in the forest chose. I only know that they recognized each other. They established a boundary. They agreed to respect it. And in that moment, something precious was preserved. The possibility that the world still contains genuine mystery. The possibility that we can coexist with other intelligences without seeking to dominate them. The possibility that intelligence can recognize intelligence and make a different choice. The arrangement holds. It's held for generations. It holds because enough people, across time, have made the choice to respect the boundary, to protect the mystery, to preserve the possibility of coexistence. And it will continue to hold as long as people keep making that choice. That's what this story is about. That's what it has always been about. Not proof or evidence or scientific documentation, but about choices. About what we decide when we encounter something that challenges our understanding of the world. About what we choose to do with our power. Tom chose restraint. The being chose respect. Duke chose protection. And in those choices, the arrangement was established. What will you choose? That's the question at the heart of this story. It's the question that Tom faced. It's the question that everyone who encounters something that challenges their understanding of reality must face. Do you pursue it? Do you expose it? Do you try to control it? Or do you respect what you've encountered? Do you acknowledge its right to exist on its own terms? Do you choose the harder path of coexistence over the easier path of dominance? I don't expect everyone to make the same choice. I don't expect everyone to believe in the existence of these beings. I don't even expect everyone to understand why Tom made the choices he made. But I hope that hearing this story might at least plant a seed of doubt. A doubt about whether we really know everything. A doubt about whether our current understanding of the natural world is complete. A doubt about whether the best response to a mystery is always to solve it. Because I think that doubt is important. I think the world needs people who are willing to admit that we don't know everything. People who are willing to respect mystery. People who are willing to choose coexistence over dominance. People who understand that just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. Tom's story is radical in its simplicity. It's a story about a man and a dog and something in the forest. It's a story about a choice made in a moment, but that moment reflects a much larger choice. A choice about what kind of world we want to live in. A choice about what we value. A choice about what we're willing to protect. The arrangement holds. It holds because people like Tom have chosen to protect it. It holds because indigenous communities have maintained the understanding for generations. It holds because enough people have decided that some things are worth more than proof or evidence or validation. It holds because we choose to let it hold. The arrangement holds. And as long as it holds, something precious survives. And as long as it holds, something precious survives. Something that the world desperately needs to keep. Something that tells us we're not alone in this world. That we're part of something larger. That intelligence takes many forms. That coexistence is possible. That mystery is worth preserving. The arrangement holds. And somewhere in the Michigan forest, a family and something unknown continue to coexist. Unknown and unmeasured and unproven, but real. Profoundly, undeniably real. And that knowledge, carried by those who know, is enough. That knowledge, respected and protected, is everything. I want to say one final thing before I end this. I want to acknowledge the difficulty of what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you to hear a story and not investigate it. I'm asking you to know that something extraordinary might be real and not try to prove it. I'm asking you to recognize a boundary and respect it, even though you have the tools to violate it. That's not easy. That goes against everything our culture teaches us. We're taught from childhood that mysteries are meant to be solved, that the unknown is meant to be discovered, that progress means pushing the boundaries of knowledge further and further. We're taught that hiding information is bad, that transparency is always better, that secrets are something to expose. And in many contexts, that's right. In many situations, those values serve us well. But this is different. This is about recognizing that there are times when the most responsible thing to do is to leave something alone. When the most ethical choice is to respect a boundary that you have the power to violate. It takes a different kind of courage to do that. It takes the courage to say, I know something and I'm not going to tell anyone. I could be famous for this discovery, and I'm choosing anonymity instead. I could prove that I'm right, and I'm choosing to remain unvalidated. I could change the world's understanding, and I'm choosing to let the mystery persist. That kind of courage is harder in many ways than the courage it takes to speak up. It's the courage to live with a secret, to carry knowledge that you can never share, to let other people believe they understand the world when you know something about it that would shatter their understanding. Tom has that courage. That's why I'm telling his story, not to convince you that dogmen are real, but to show you that that kind of courage is possible, that someone can make that choice, that it can be the right choice, that sometimes restraint is more important than revelation. What I think about most when I think about Tom's story is what it says about human potential, not our potential to discover and dominate and control, but our potential to recognize intelligence in something other than ourselves and to respect it, our potential to see a boundary and to honor it, our potential to choose restraint when we have the power to choose domination. Tom had a choice. He could have been a man who changed the world through a single act of disclosure. He could have been famous. He could have been right. He could have been vindicated. But he would have destroyed an arrangement that had been maintained for generations. He would have broken a covenant that was older than his family's ownership of the land. He would have violated something that countless people before him had chosen to protect. Instead, he chose to add his weight to the other side of the scale. He chose to be one more person in a long chain of people who'd said no to exposure, no to proof, no to fame, yes to silence, yes to respect, yes to mystery. That's not a heroic choice in the traditional sense. It doesn't come with accolades or recognition. It doesn't add to the store of human knowledge. It doesn't make the world a more known place. But it preserves something that's equally important. It preserves the world as a place where there are still genuine mysteries, where there are still beings that exist outside our understanding, where there are still boundaries that humans can choose to respect. And in the end, I think that's more valuable than any discovery. I think a world that still contains mystery is a world worth fighting for. And Tom understood that. That's why he made the choice he made. That's why he's still making that choice every day. I've thought about what I'm doing by telling this story. I've thought about whether I'm breaking the arrangement by making it public. I've thought about whether the very act of narration undermines the principle I'm trying to communicate. And I've concluded that it doesn't, because I'm not telling this story as proof. I'm not telling it to convince you that these beings exist. I'm telling it to convince you that the choice to respect mystery is possible, that intelligence can recognize intelligence and choose coexistence, that it's possible to know something extraordinary and still say nothing about it. That's the story that matters. That's the story that needs to be told, not the story of a cryptid in the Michigan forest, but the story of a man who knew about a cryptid and chose to keep that knowledge secret, the story of what it costs to make that choice, the story of what you gain by making it, because every person who hears this story and understands it, every person who grasps what Tom sacrificed and why he did it, every person who recognizes that restraint is a form of courage, becomes part of the larger arrangement, becomes part of the network of people who understand that some things are more important than proof, becomes part of the community that recognizes that mystery deserves protection. That's the real power of the story. Not that it proves the existence of dogmen or cryptids or unknown intelligent beings in the forest, but that it creates a community of people who understand the value of preserving mystery, who understand that the world is better when it still contains things we don't fully know, who understand that sometimes the bravest choice is to say nothing, to know something and to keep it secret, to respect a boundary even when you have the power to violate it. Tom is part of that community. His family is part of it. I'm part of it now. And anyone who hears this story and understands what it's really about becomes part of it too. We're all participants in the arrangement. We're all choosing, through our engagement with this story, to protect something larger than ourselves. The arrangement is fragile, though. It depends on people making the right choice, on people being willing to resist the urge to investigate, on people being willing to say, I believe this is possible, and I'm going to respect that possibility by not trying to prove it. It takes discipline to do that. It takes the ability to hold two contradictory impulses at the same time. The impulse to investigate and the discipline to resist it. The desire to know and the commitment to not knowing. These are not natural human impulses for most of us. We're built to be curious. We're built to investigate. We're built to solve mysteries. But we can learn to do otherwise. We can learn to recognize when investigation would cause harm. We can learn to see a boundary and respect it. We can learn to live with the knowledge that some things will remain mysterious. That's what Tom learned. That's what his family learned. That's what I learned through talking with him. And that's what I want to pass on to you through this story. The arrangement holds because people choose to respect it. It will continue to hold as long as people keep making that choice. And it will break the moment enough people decide that proof is more important than mystery. That validation is more important than respect. That being right is more important than being wise. So the question is really about you, about what you're going to do with this story, about whether you're going to be part of the community of people who understand the value of mystery, or whether you're going to be part of the force that pushes to violate boundaries. That choice matters. It matters more than you might think, because every person who respects the boundary is contributing to the conditions that allow the arrangement to persist. Every person who hears this story and chooses to believe it, to accept it as possible, to respect the mystery, is adding their weight to the side of the scale that preserves something precious. Every person who decides that knowing the truth is less important than respecting the mystery is making a difference. This is how the arrangement survives, not through any single dramatic act, but through the cumulative choices of many people across many years, through the quiet decision to leave something alone, through the restraint of not investigating, through the wisdom of accepting that some things are better left mysterious. That's the story. That's what I want you to take away from this. Not the facts about dogmen or cryptids or unknown beings in the Michigan forest, but the philosophy behind Tom's choice, the understanding that coexistence is possible, the recognition that intelligence can meet intelligence and choose respect, the knowledge that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to say nothing, to know something and to keep it secret, to love a mystery enough to protect it.